fabulous. We're here, day 3 of this great event. I've been fortunate to have been a part of this since its inception, so it just gets bigger and bigger, and the crowd gets better looking every year. So we're glad they're here. We have a really good topic here today, which is effective policies for crypto assets. We don't want ineffective policies, we want good policies. But we're going to have policies one way or the other, I can assure you that. So let's get started. We got a couple of different themes, and we have a short period of time, but we also want to make sure the audience has a chance to get their questions in as well. And you know how to do that, and I have the pad up here, and I will find a way to fold them in. First question, first theme is, should policymakers retrofit rules made decades ago for traditional finance, or should they take an opportunity to reimagine what the technology in mind, what it looks like? So Sigal, you've been in the public sector, you've been a senior US government official, you've been in the middle of this storm for a very long time. Now you're in the private sector at Ribbit. How do you see this dichotomy between traditional institutions, traditional rule book, versus what needs to happen now?
I think it's a great question. It's actually one of my favorite questions. And I'm going to answer it by relating it to US law, because that's what I'm most familiar with. Number one, 1930s. In the US, that's when our primary statutes were passed having to do with securities law. 1930s. At that time, something like 1930, 200 million telegrams were sent. That's not the telegram that you all now have on your app. That's like the wire telegrams, okay? And then 1940, there was a case out of the US Supreme Court that had to do with orange groves that was interpreting the 1930s statute. That orange grove case is still the same standard that we use today in the United States to determine whether or not a digital asset is a security.
The Harvey test.
The Howey test, right, exactly. So how many of you think that orange groves are transparent? Nobody. Or immutable? No one, right? Orange groves were in a farm somewhere far away that nobody could see. Most people couldn't even eat the orange, and yet somehow that's the same test. The standard that was built off of orange groves is the same test that we use today to determine whether or not something is or isn't a security. Similarly, how many of you remember, have ever used a rotary phone? Okay, we're all old on this stage.
We are, yes.
Apparently. So how many of you know what a rotary phone is? So a rotary phone was a thing that we used in the 1970s where you would literally, to dial a number, you had to like turn a dial around. And apparently the area codes that were used to determine, were determined by density of population. So New York City is 212 because there were many people in New York City, and it was less physical effort to turn that dial. So that's from the 1970s. The 1970s is also when the Bank Secrecy Act was passed. So today in the United States, which has to do with anti-money laundering, we are still using statutes that had to do, when the technology wasn't the iPhone, the technology had to do with rotary phones. Now the question is, are those old statutes, when the technology was radically different, the same statutes that we should be using today to guide us in how we regulate digital assets? To my mind, the answer is clearly no, right? We have to be able to take advantage of the attributes and really understand the attributes of these fundamentally new products, and then decide what are the rules that we can build around them to protect consumers, to disrupt illicit finance, to do all of those things that regulations are intended to do, but also to enable innovation to thrive, just like we've seen all around the past couple of days in this incredible conference.
I would just add that I think the answer ends up being, to your question, both. Do we need new regulators and do you need new regulations, or should you apply the current ones? I think in the path or on the path to create new regulations and new regulators for this specific digital asset space, I think it's fine for you to educate the regulators and educate the industry by trying to fit them in these boxes that we do have so that you understand what fits and what doesn't fit. And I think that understanding is actually understanding that should be taken for the next step, which is then creating new regulations for it.
Well, you went through that process. You're a licensed regulated entity in the United States. How did you approach the regulatory question? Was there a substantial education program that you had to go through?
100% from every single regulator. Again, in the United States, is not Singapore. Singapore has the MAS, which is a single regulator for everything. You did this right. In the United States, there's no single regulator, so there's many regulators, states, federal, many different types, and you have to talk to all of them, and you have to have these conversations over and over again. So I think Anchorage is the first federally chartered crypto bank in the United States, and the interesting thing is that, to the prior question, we fit into the former category. We're fitting into a very clear box. There's a very clear box. There's a very clear boundary. It's called a Federal Chartered Bank, and it's regulated by the OCC within the United States, which is the oldest banking regulator in the United States. There's a very clear box. There's very clear expectations, and that's what we went out and set out to do. The space needs regulation, and so let's voluntarily go towards the highest regulatory regime in the land to then show the big institutions that this is actually something that is not the Wild Wild West, that there's actually rules that apply to it. Of course, as part of this process, we end up realizing that many of these things don't actually fit. And so there's many other things that you have to talk to the OCC and to all these other regulators around education of why doesn't it fit? Right. So a lot of those conversations are being had constantly because it's very weird to have an asset that, it's bearer instruments. We got rid of bearer instruments a few decades ago, and now we're bringing them back.
Well, that's a question for the audience, and it goes to your point, Sigal. If we have an analog regulatory system, but you've found a way to fit yourself into that. What's the right system? What does the right set of policies look like? What would you like to see?
I'm happy to start. What I would like to see all over the world is what we're actually seeing in Singapore, frankly, because in Singapore, the government is experimenting with the technology, right? There was just this incredible announcement about Aave and the government experience with Aave and Polygon, and that experimentation allows MAS to actually really pay attention to what's happening in these ecosystems. What does the world look like when we don't have centralized intermediaries, but we allow people to engage with each other through code? So I actually think it would be easy for me to sit here and say, well, the rules should be X, Y, and Z. I don't actually know quite yet what the rules should be. Because I think it's really important for regulators to be able to access the technology, work hand in hand with the private sector, find out what you can do within the technology to protect from cyber hacks and scams and AML. What can you encode in the technology that looks fundamentally different from what we have today in traditional finance, but actually at the end of the day may be better. And it's through that public-private cooperation and collaboration that I think that we can come up ultimately with a much better set of rules for the many decades to come. Again, I was a former regulator. I was the top AML and sanctions official in the United States, and we actually did a lot to provide guidance to the private sector in terms of anti-money laundering and what they needed to do with crypto. But we also allowed this space for experimentation, I think, which was really, really important. Going forward, I think we can ultimately come up with a much better set of rules that are fit for purpose for this new technology and take advantage of the technology to do the things that we need to do to protect citizens.
So we have laboratories like Singapore, which we can learn from and disseminate those lessons to other parts of the world. What would you have liked to see different when you went through the process?
Well, I do think that we have to understand that there's going to be friction, and so a process with less friction would have been great. But I think it's understandable that there's a lot of friction. I think to a certain extent, I don't envy the job of the regulator. We're trying to regulate a moving target. You're trying to regulate something that is not. It's not there and it's stopped and is fully evolved and baked in, and whose characteristics are actually set in stone. It is very different to have a conversation about whether some random token is a security or not than to talk about decentralized autonomous organizations and supranational organizations where you actually don't have a legal fiction in a specific country. So how does that work? And how does that work when it's truly decentralized and when it's truly a shared governance mechanism? These are just such different conversations, and they're all bucketed within this, overall crypto moniker, but crypto is 15 different things. And 15 different things should actually have probably about 15 different regimes. Maybe not 15, maybe 10, maybe 2, maybe 3, whatever it is, but they're very different types of assets, very different types of objectives, and we're asking the regulators to create actual set-in-stone regulation, and by the way, asking them for consistency and applicability towards, I don't want this to change for the next 20 years. I want this to be actual permanent. And those two are competing objectives. You either want regulation or you want regulation that is actually long-lived. You can't have both for an actual technology that is actually evolving day by day. So that's what I want. I actually want a lot more regulatory clarity, and I also want the understanding from the private sector that regulatory clarity will have to change, maybe on a yearly basis. Right. But that's actually not the expectation of the private sector. The private sector also wants clarity and permanency. And so those two things should be on my side. Anchorage Digital is in the private sector. I think we have to give that up in terms of, obviously these rules, if we want clarity on them, we probably also have to be lenient and flexible about them changing.
Sigal, I'm going to come to you. You and I have spent a lot of time in our lives looking at illicit financial flows, AML, sanctions, a lot of work on sanctions these days. How can crypto assets or the crypto infrastructure help with operational resilience and risk, and how can we address a system that, by all measures, not done well in terms of getting illicit financial flows?
Well, one of the amazing things I think about this sector, which is why I'm so excited to be part of it, is that you literally have some of the smartest computer scientists in the world working on building fundamentally new technology, fundamentally new architecture for how we interact with each other. I was always taught that when you get the smartest people focused on a particular problem, you're gonna figure out how to solve that problem, maybe even in a better way than what we have with traditional finance. So, and we're investing in a lot of those kinds of companies that are really focused on how do we make it safe, secure, and allow it to grow, like Chainalysis. Diogo and I are both involved in a company called Sealance, which has the potential really to do remarkable things to programmatically embed compliance within the blockchain that can be multi-chain. We're in Fireblocks. We're just in a lot of the companies that I think are building out an entirely new mechanism to be able to make the space safe and secure. And I think it's really very exciting. It's also, I think what we're going to see is we're also going to see real solutions for systemic problems that we have in traditional finance. Right. So just as an example, today, I don't believe any of us own our identity, right? If you have a bank account and a mortgage and a car lease and whatever it is, you've sent all of your documents out to 100 different places, which means that all of your documents are sitting in various honeypots that are, just ripe for the taking from fraudsters. And we do that in the name of KYC, which is an element of, detecting and disrupting illicit finance, but by doing so, we're potentially exposing people time and time again to have their identity stolen. What you can do with this technology is reclaim your identity. Right. In really fundamentally different and very exciting things so that you don't have to send out your KYC to 1,000 different places.
We're getting a number of questions from the audience, so let me loop those in. Diogo, for you, it says, what do you think are the most pressing issues to be regulated in regards to crypto?
Well, many of them are already regulated, and I think anti-money laundering, obviously, and meeting the BSA Act in the United States, but really making sure that this financial industry that is being created works with the same type of expectations that the private financial industry has in terms of what the actual government of the specific country wants to do. I think that is a condition, it exists today. We know, we have clarity on what that is. I think one of the interesting things that the industry talks a lot about and that the question is driving at, we started this industry with Bitcoin. and specifically crypto assets. And Bitcoin was not actually an asset that was created with meeting regulatory regime and regulation in mind. It was just not. And I think one of the things that we should do as an industry is realize that if we want good crypto-native solutions to the regulatory problems that we are, that we're bringing to the forefront by creating these digital assets, then we should be the ones to actually build those tools. I think right now there's a little bit of a mismatch of we develop these privacy-preserving tools, but without actually allowing for the regulation to be met, we're not going to like what the outcome is going to be, because there will be regulation and there will be a necessity of meeting the current regulatory regime, which is not going to change. The expectation of not being able to fund terrorists, that's obviously not going to change. So we need a way to do it just for normal civilized society to continue existing. And it should be the crypto native and it should be the actual builders to make sure that they understand what the expectations are and build it directly into the crypto native stack. And Sigal mentioned companies like Sealance. They're exactly doing that. Crypto-native solutions directly into the blockchain without waiting for the regulators to catch up and saying, oh wait, you have no solution for this, so I'm going to now mandate you to do this other thing over here that is centralized and potentially very awful as an outcome, and it actually will reduce the privacy of every single participant because it's a centralized database that has every single transaction. That is actually going to be the outcome if you don't care to actually build the tools directly into the product.
So are we over-expecting too much from the public sector, from the regulatory sector, and keeping up a sector that's maybe still analog? How quickly can they become digitized?
Well, the one thing that I'll just say, and Sigal obviously is a way better person to answer this, but one thing that I have to say is picking up on what was said and on the MAS actually having these sandboxes where you can actually see how things work before you regulate them. That is extremely important. Right. Because these things are moving so fast. So I think the process needs to be, we allow the space to do things, we set actually boundaries that are obvious boundaries of things that we don't want to see, but we allow the space to come up with what is actually the right solutions, and then we actually regulate those solutions in a way that actually matches the benefits of the technology and covers for the potential risks. And to a large extent, that is actually not being done anywhere else. Again, the MAS is doing it, Singapore is doing it, but the United States, that does not exist.
Right. The BIS has its innovation hubs. But same question you go, and take it a step further. You've been in the public sector, private sector. What should a partnership look like in order to further the technological frontier?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, the reason it's so exciting to see what the MAS is doing is in large part because it's not possible in the United States. So today, in the US, if you are a regulator and you have anything to do with crypto policy, you're not allowed to have any crypto. So you can't actually go in and experiment with the technology. It's kind of like you have a blindfold over your head as you're making over your eyes, as you're making new rules. That's a big problem, right? I could, as a regulator, I could have a bank account, right? And I yet could also supervise all of the U.S. financial institutions. If you believe, I think, as probably Diogo and I do, that part of what's being built in this infrastructure is completely new financial architecture, then it simply doesn't make sense that as a former regulator, I couldn't experiment with the technology. So that's number one. We just need to change that. I also think you need to have real public-private sector collaboration where you basically put everybody in a room for 2 or 3 weeks, focus on a particular problem, whether it's illicit finance, consumer protection, investor protection, map out the entire ecosystem or the entire life cycle of a transaction, look to see where the vulnerabilities are in that life cycle, and before saying, I'm just going to hammer that life cycle with a bunch of old rules, talk to the technologists and the computer scientists and see whether or not they can develop the kind of technology Diogo and I were talking about to help weed out some of those risks and vulnerabilities, and then build the rules that make sense and provide clarity around it. I honestly believe that if people had the time to do that together, we would be able to come up with an entirely new set of rules that actually made a lot more sense, and technology that's fit for purpose that allows innovation to grow and thrive in the ways that we all know that it can be.
I completely agree, and that's going to be the last word. We're out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, please give them a round of applause.